In 2008, people didn't just lose money, they lost their sense of reality. One day they were living the system, and the next day the system revealed it was built on assumptions that were never meant to survive contact with human greed. If you feel something in the air right now, you're not crazy, you're just paying attention. And the truth you've been avoiding is this: financial crises are not only events, they are confessions. They expose what everyone pretended wasn't there. Welcome to the Hidden Self, where we talk about the things society trains you to ignore. In this episode, I'm going to connect the mechanics of the 2008 crisis to the mechanics of how people behave inside a collapsing world. Because the same psychology that makes a bank loosen standards also makes a normal person chase risk, hide their fears, and call it opportunity. And if you can't see that pattern in yourself, you will keep being harvested when the next wave hits, even if you swear you'll be smarter this time. Here's what I want you to do while you listen. Don't treat this as history. Treat it as a mirror. Ask yourself what you're doing when you feel pressure to keep up, when you're tempted to believe what sounds good, when you're rationalizing a decision that feels slightly wrong. Crises are not only about money, they're about self-deception under stress. Let's start with the moment the world went blind. It begins with a promise that sounds safe because it's complicated. In the late years before 2008, the story was simple. The system is too big to fail. The banks were presented as careful engines of stability, and the markets were portrayed as intelligent weather systems that balance risk. But beneath that soothing narrative was a very human pattern. When people believe they won't face consequences, they stop behaving like adults and start behaving like gamblers. Banks don't wake up one morning and decide to collapse. They evolve. They drift. They loosen standards the way a person loosens their standards in a relationship. At first, it's small. This is different. We can manage it. We have models. The rating agencies say it's fine. That's how the trap works. It doesn't arrive with a siren. It arrives with paperwork and confident tone. The core banking model is supposed to be boring. Accept deposits, then lend at a higher rate. The difference pays for operations and creates profit. In a healthy system, risk is limited by rules. But when profit becomes the only god, rules start to feel like moral weakness. The bank becomes less interested in who you are and more interested in what you can produce for the next quarter. And that's where the hidden mechanism shows up. When an institution is pressured for short-term performance, it starts outsourcing responsibility. It stops asking, will the borrower repay? And starts asking, can we package this and sell it before the consequences arrive? Risk becomes a rumor. It spreads. It gets diluted into something that feels like safety because it can be bought and traded. So what happened at 2008 wasn't just irresponsible lending. It was the mass conversion of uncertainty into a product. Loans that were never meant to be safe got engineered into financial instruments that sounded clean. Subprime mortgages, loans to people with weak or no ability to repay reliably, were no longer treated like red flags. They became raw material. Now imagine you're a normal person reading this. Your mind probably says, I would never do that, I'm not greedy. But greed is not only a personality trait. Greed is also a coping strategy. Greed is how people manage anxiety when they fear being left behind. Greed is how a person avoids admitting, I don't feel secure. So they chase something that can temporarily numb fear: status, income, a rising asset, a number going up. Before the crash, the American home was marketed like proof of worth. Owning a house was treated as a moral achievement. People weren't just buying property, they were buying an identity. The identity was, I'm a builder, I'm stable, I'm successful. And identity is powerful. It makes people ignore reality. It makes them sign papers even when the math screams. It makes them believe that tomorrow will fix today. Then the interest rates on these risky mortgages began to change. The teaser rates that looked harmless for a while turned into a trap door. Payments rose. In a healthy world, that would cause a correction. But the correction didn't happen because the system had been designed to look away from first principles. The loans didn't stay with the lenders long enough to be judged. This is where the crisis became global. The moment loans get packaged into mortgage-backed securities, the original relationship breaks. The lender is no longer the custodian of your future. Your repayment becomes someone else's spreadsheet. The risk gets sliced and diced and sold to pension funds, banks, investors, sometimes even institutions far away that had no lived understanding of what these homes and families actually meant. And then the next layer appears: tranches. Risk is reorganized into tiers with different labels. Some get a higher rating, so people treat that rating like a priesthood. If an authority says safe, then the human brain relaxes. It's the same psychological shortcut people use on social media. If everyone is saying it, it must be true. If the platform rewards it, it must be good for you. Ratings become social proof, but in a suit. The hidden self hates uncertainty. The hidden self wants comfort. The hidden self wants to believe in safety because safety reduces internal pain. So when the financial world promised safety through ratings and structure, millions of people accepted the comfort and stopped asking the brutal question: who actually bears the loss? The answer is always the same, and it's always delayed. Loss is absorbed by someone, and it spreads through the system like infection. When the housing market cracks, the underlying mortgages stop paying. The securities built on them lose value. The tranches designed to look protected become damaged anyway, because the foundation was rotten. This is the psychological part people don't want to face. The system didn't collapse because the market suddenly learned math. It collapsed because everyone agreed to pretend. And pretending requires coordination. It requires silence. It requires people who know enough to hesitate, but choose not to because hesitation could cost them status, bonuses, promotion, or comfort. A crisis is often a social crime committed politely. Now picture the domino effect. When asset values drop, banks become afraid of each other. Credit markets freeze. This is not just about cash. It's about trust, and trust evaporates faster than liquidity can be replaced. In a stable system, banks lend because they believe counterparties will survive. In a collapsing system, they hoard. They stop trusting. They stop moving money because moving money means admitting there is risk, and admitting risk means admitting your models were wrong. So what happens? The economy starts strangling itself. Businesses can't refinance. Workers get laid off. Supply chains wobble. People feel the crash in their stomach before they see it in their portfolio. This is where many viewers are going to recognize something personal, because you may have experienced micro crashes in your own life. Maybe not on a market scale, but emotionally. Maybe you've had moments where you couldn't trust anyone, where you stopped committing because you didn't want to feel foolish again. Maybe you've tightened your spending. Maybe you stopped helping. Maybe you've become cautious in a way that looks responsible, but actually protects your ego. That's the hidden self at work. When trust breaks, people either retreat into numbness or they double down into control. Crises force everyone to choose, and most people pick the choice that keeps their identity intact. In 2008, millions picked the double-down path until the system finally stopped allowing denial. Home prices stopped rising. Liquidity disappeared. People couldn't sell their houses for a profit. They couldn't refinance. And when they couldn't refinance, they defaulted. Default is a word people treat like a technical event, but for individuals, it's a lived humiliation. It's a family shame. It's a court notice. It's a phone call you don't answer. It's the slow realization that you bought an identity you can't afford to maintain. And then, once the defaults became visible, the illusion of safety became unbearable. Mortgage-backed securities were no longer just volatile. They were toxic. CDOs and other packaged debt obligations built on top of these mortgages collapsed in value. Complexity didn't save anyone. Complexity only delayed the reckoning. Now think about how this relates to you in 2026. We live in a world where complexity is marketed as sophistication, and sophistication is marketed as safety. People use complicated explanations to cover simple motives. They disguise incentives. They hide the real risk. They turn desire into an algorithmic story and call it investing. They tell you to believe in your future because the chart looks friendly. The same psychological engine drives both. In the months leading up to 2008, there were signs. Housing markets were softening. Sales slowed. Prices that had been rising began to wobble. Liquidity got worse. Anyone who looked closely could see the cracks forming. But cracks are not exciting. They don't trend on a screen. They don't create a dopamine loop. And most people would rather live in an encouraging illusion than investigate a frightening one. That's the first uncomfortable truth. People don't ignore danger because they're stupid. They ignore it because attention to danger creates unbearable internal tension. You see it in relationships, too. Someone senses dishonesty. They feel uneasy. They try to interpret it away. They focus on the good days. They cling to hope, because hope is a sedative. When the truth arrives, it arrives like a foreclosure notice, late, then sudden. So in 2008, the suddenness was real. But it wasn't an accident. It was the delayed unveiling of what was always true. When major institutions failed, the world learned that too big to fail was never a promise. It was a fantasy used to keep risk-taking comfortable. Once trust collapsed, even good assets couldn't be sold. Even credible balance sheets turned into trapped money because markets stopped functioning normally. The government then stepped in with massive rescue efforts to prevent total economic collapse. Here's the second uncomfortable truth. Rescues don't heal trust. They temporarily replace consequences with borrowed time. And borrowed time breeds the next round of denial, because if you can get bailed out once, you start to assume you'll be bailed out again. If consequences are soft, people become harder. They push the limit until they learn the limit again. Now let's talk about the human cost, because this is where people get shallow. They think the crisis is a market event. It wasn't. It was a social rupture. When credit freezes, companies stop investing and start surviving. Survival means layoffs. Layoffs mean households lose income. Lost income means delayed bills. Delayed bills become missed payments. Missed payments become defaults in personal life as well. That's the chain reaction. And for many countries, unemployment rose rapidly. People don't understand how fast a lifestyle can break. They think they have time. They think savings protect them. But savings can evaporate when your income disappears, while expenses continue and debts remain. This isn't about bad financial choices alone. This is about how systems transmit shock. When a global market collapses, the shock moves through jobs first, then through housing, then through health, then through dignity. Dignity matters. A person losing a home isn't just losing shelter, they're losing their role. They're losing their family's stability. They're losing the story they told themselves about being in control. And the psychological fallout is often worse than the financial fallout, because the mind blames itself. People say, "I should have known. I'm not smart. I made a mistake." Then shame prevents them from asking for help. Shame makes them isolate. Isolation makes recovery slower. This is why crises create generational trauma. People don't just remember losses, they remember the feeling of being powerless. Then they raise children with fear. And those children learn the wrong lesson. They learn to trust less, risk less, and chase status more. They can become financially conservative on the surface while emotionally compulsive underneath. So when you hear people say 2008 taught us lessons, understand that most people didn't learn the real lesson. They learned surface lessons about regulations, but they kept the inner patterns: fear of missing out, desire to appear competent, willingness to outsource responsibility, and a preference for narratives that soothe. Now, the script gets real for viewers outside the United States. When the global crisis hit, it didn't respect borders. Exports slowed. Trade partners demanded less. Countries that relied heavily on global demand felt the squeeze. In places where growth had been fueled by global capital and exports, the collapse showed up in orders, factories, and hiring. Companies reduced production. Workers lost jobs. Investment slowed. Stock markets plunged. And then, as money moved away, currencies faced pressure. Foreign investment, the rocket fuel of many emerging markets, becomes a predator in crises. It leaves quickly, because it can. It searches for safety, not loyalty. This is the third uncomfortable truth. When your economy or your personal life is built on external funding, you don't control your future. You just rent it. You've likely felt this personally without realizing it. Maybe your job depends on a market you don't understand. Maybe your income depends on a business trend you can't predict. Maybe your relationship depends on someone else's mood. Then, when the external factor shifts, you feel betrayed, even though it was obvious all along. Humans call it bad luck, but systems don't care about luck. Systems reward flexibility and punish dependency. Now fast forward to the years after 2008, where the world tried to patch the wound with more money. Governments and central banks used stimulus to stabilize economies. Markets recovered. People moved on. That's how time works. Pain fades. Memory becomes a story you tell yourself to feel wise. But the underlying psychology doesn't change. If anything, it hardens. After each rescue, the system becomes more accustomed to intervention. And when intervention is expected, risk appetites grow. Investors become bolder. Leverage rises. Asset prices detach from fundamental value. Bubbles form where people believe reality can be postponed. So in 2025, you see familiar ingredients again. Not identical, but familiar. Public debt levels are rising. Governments carry burdens that make them sensitive to interest rate changes. When rates go up, debt costs rise. When rates go down, debt still has to be managed. Either way, the system is under pressure. At the same time, speculation returns. Money that should go into productive work starts chasing numbers that rise fast. Property, stocks, high-risk instruments, and the promise of quick gains. Speculation inflates asset prices, and inflated asset prices create a feeling of safety. People see wealth growing and conclude that the wealth is real. But asset inflation is not the same as wealth creation. It's often wealth relocation and risk transfer. It's a scoreboard that looks like progress. And that brings me to the deepest uncomfortable truth in this entire episode. Most people don't actually want financial stability. They want financial validation. They want numbers that prove they're okay. That's why people keep buying into overvalued assets even after they feel uneasy. Uncertainty threatens identity. So they buy, they hold, they double down, not because the math is strong, but because the psychological need is urgent. Now add another pressure, inflation combined with stagnation. When prices rise while growth slows, people get squeezed from both sides.